next in the CCI seminar series. Earlier on, as I'm sure you remember, we had a series of talks on COVID and what we could do to stop the next pandemic and the consequences for the wildlife trade, etc. What we're doing in this seminar is we're considering what are the consequences and what are likely to be the consequences of COVID for nature conservation. So we've got three components. First of all, Nancy's going to talk about a CCI review that was done that I'm sure a number of you were involved in, looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on global nature conservation. Then Mike Maunders is going to talk about conservation impacts of COVID-19 a personal perspective, talking about his views of it. And then I hope that we're going to have a general discussion. And I'd like us to talk about what we might do to take advantage of the opportunities that COVID produces and also to reduce the risks that come from COVID. So I'd like if possible to have a general discussion. So I'd encourage you to think of contributions to each. Also, we will have questions at the end of Nancy and Mike's talk, just about their talk in itself before we then go to that general discussion. So first of all, I'm sure almost all of you know Nancy Ockendon works in the Endangered Landscape Programme as their science coordinator. Nancy.
Thank you, Bill. So as Bill has nicely introduced, I'm going to talk about an exercise that was carried out by CCI to try and identify and assess the impacts of the COVID pandemic on global biodiversity conservation. I thought I'd quickly, firstly, introduce myself to those who don't know me. As Bill says, I work as the science coordinator on the Endangered Landscapes Programme, and that's a programme that's based in the core team of CCI in the Executive Director's Office, and it aims to restore Europe's degraded landscapes. We mainly do that by funding large-scale restoration projects across Europe. We've got 8 of those at the moment, and CCI partner organisations are involved in several of those. We also fund small planning grants for projects at earlier stages, as well as what we call enabling activity grants, which fund sort of activities to improve our understanding and capacity to do landscape restoration, which are also open to CCI organisations. Anyway, moving back to the matter in hand, talking about impacts of COVID. So, as I say, this was an exercise that was conceived within CCI as something that CCI felt like it could contribute, given the unprecedented circumstances we've been in this year. So COVID's affected everybody, inside conservation, outside conservation, personally, professionally, and there have been direct effects of the pandemic and the spread of the disease, but also lots of indirect effects in terms of the responses of governments, organisations, and the public as well. And I think one of the most challenging things has been the uncertainty associated with all those different impacts, really. And I put this picture up. We had our project meeting last week, and one of our projects is based in Belarus, and this is a photo they put up from Minsk, and I think definitely up to the presidential elections, their government was behaving as business as usual. There were mass demonstrations. Apparently, this poster in the background says "Immortality" in Belarusian, and they've made a coronavirus model out of the Belarusian flag. So just showing the sort of range of responses that are out there. I think CCI thought it was in a good position to carry out this exercise because of the array of organisations, the different geographies that you will work across, the different roles that people are working on. So it felt that CCI was in a good position to give an overview of what's happened, to reflect on what we've learned already, and also think about the longer term impacts, which is probably more important, as Bill said, to think about what might be coming up in the future, both in terms of negative challenges, but also opportunities, and how the conservation community can be best prepared to meet those. And this was in terms of responding both to the current pandemic and, I mean, most predictions say, I mean, horrible to think about it at the moment, though it is there, this is not going to be the only pandemic. So also what we can carry forward and learn to the future. I should say this is a very collaborative project. Lots of people have been involved from all across CCI and beyond. It was led very effectively and ably by David Gibbons, who did most of the work. David, formerly of the RSPB, helped by Bill and also Chris Sambrook. So in this talk, I'm just going to give a brief outline of the methods we use to identify and assess these impacts, and then just a short outline of the results. And as Bill says, it would be good if we can have some conversations about what you think of these impacts and also what we can do to respond to them. And I should also say this has been submitted as a manuscript to Conservation Biology. So in terms of the methods, there were two parts to this exercise. The first part was identifying as comprehensive as possible a list of impacts of the pandemic on global nature conservation. And this was a very consultative exercise. And previously, this consultation might have involved talking to people and workshops, but instead it involved lots of virtual conversations, which is already an impact of the pandemic there. CCI is obviously a really wide number of people, number of organisations, so we consulted across that, and we also consulted across their networks. We really wanted to make this a truly global exercise, so we also involved the MPhil in Conservation Leadership alumni, which I expect most of you know. That's a very diverse group of experienced conservationists working in all sorts of countries across the world. So it was brilliant to have their contributions to this exercise. Because I think, as I've mentioned, the effects really do vary between regions and countries. So what happened was that we asked all those people to suggest plausible impacts that either they'd experienced, they'd heard about, or they thought might happen. And we circulated a list and people added to it. And David very effectively brought those topics together in themes. He combined ones that he thought were similar, and as I say, sort of grouped them into sets to produce a full list of all the potential impacts of COVID and the pandemic and the responses to it on conservation and conservation organisations. Once we had that full list, each impact was written up with a paragraph which described what we thought its potential impacts were, how the mechanism might work, and supporting evidence. And the time frame from this, most of the work for this project went on between sort of June and August this year, so it was sort of fairly early on in the lockdown. And a lot of the evidence we had to draw on was sort of reports, news articles, blogs, anecdotes, although sometimes we could draw in evidence from previous crises, whether they be disease crises or other economic crises. But there was quite a lot of sort of personal judgment and experience put into these paragraphs. Once we had this full long list of impacts, the next stage was to try and rank them by what we thought were going to be the really important ones for conservation. And we did this by means of a survey. This was circulated to all the authors of the paper and some additional MPhil alumni to really give that diversity of views on what were the most important impacts. So all the people who took part in the survey were asked to read all of the impacts and their associated paragraphs and use the information in them, but also their experience and judgment to assess how important they thought that impact was. We devised a scoring system which had 3 different dimensions for assessing how important each impact was. The first dimension was its importance, and we thought this was something people could assess at quite a fine grain, so we used a numerical score which went from 0 to 100, and it included aspects of both the size of an impact and also its geographical spread. So to get a really high score like 90, it would need to be a really high impact with also a global spread. The second dimension we used was the time period we thought the impact would last for, and that was split into short, medium and long, with short being less than 1 year, medium being 1 to 5 years, and long being more than 5 years. And it's quite interesting to think about this. I think definitely in the time since we've done this exercise, my perspective of the duration of the pandemic and its impacts has changed already in that sort of 2 months. I think at the beginning of lockdown, we thought by 1 year's time, the pandemic will be over and we'll be into the recovery phase, whereas it feels much more now that we're into a sort of ongoing situation, which won't have such a sort of discrete end point. So we might have done those things differently now, but those are interesting things to think about. And the final dimension was the likelihood of the impact occurring, low, medium or high. Some things had already been seen. So for example, impacts on things like education, training courses, stakeholder engagement, as in this photo. They've already been seen, so we knew they would happen. So they had a high probability. Whereas other things, for example, how governments will respond in terms of helping the economy recover, or changes to maybe wildlife legislation, those things might have more uncertainty associated with them. And then we collected in all these survey data and calculated a combined score for each of those 3 dimensions and ranked the impact by each of those dimensions. And I can talk a bit more about that if you'd like me to, but I wasn't planning to here. So to go on to what we found, after David had done his sort of combining and theming the list of impacts, he came up with a full list of 70 different impacts grouped into 18 different themes. Each theme was given each impact, was given a directionality. So they were written up as either positive or negative for nature conservation. And although we found most impacts were negative, there were also a substantial number that could have potential positive impacts for biodiversity. And there were quite a lot of impacts that had both negative and positive impacts, or could potentially. So for example, the switch to online learning could have been negative because it might exclude people either don't have access or don't want to engage with online learning. But on the other hand, it might make it much more inclusive. People aren't bound by geography, the costs are lower. So people were asked to assess the negative and the positive impacts of each aspects of each of those impacts separately. I think I mentioned at the beginning that impacts could be direct or indirect, and of the 70 impacts, only 1 was a direct impact of COVID itself on nature conservation, and all the others were indirect and related to societal responses to it. So to give you an idea of what the list of impacts look like, this is the top 3 sub-themes from what we called our compendium of impacts. And we hope that this in itself is a useful resource, just having a list of all these potential impacts to think about and consider, we hope is a useful resource, and will be put in full in the appendix of the paper. That first impact is the only direct impact we see, which is the potential infection of non-human populations by COVID, obviously sort of endangered populations of great apes being infected and populations being decimated is a potentially significant impact. The second theme is to do with effects of lockdowns, travel restrictions, and quarantine on human mobility, and the impacts that's likely to have on nature and nature conservation. And the third theme is about pollution. And particularly at the beginning of lockdown, there was quite a lot of publicity about cities being quiet, changes in, I guess, business, travel, people's movements, and how that affects pollution. So that's to give you an idea. So I think that's the top 10 of the 70 impacts that we came up with. So as I say, we then sent that out to the participants for scoring, and we really wanted to get a good diversity of participants taking part in this survey. I think it gives it validity if we can say this is a truly global survey from a range of organisations and different sectors. We got 46 participants, which we were pleased with. We were doing it in the middle of summer on a really tight timeline, and it was quite a lot of work for them. We had a good gender balance. We had 43% female and 57% male respondents. We had nationals from 27 different countries, and those people had worked in conservation across 49 different countries. And we ensured we had at least 4 people who had worked on each of the continents, apart from Antarctica, to show that we really had that sort of depth of experience of different geographies. We asked people what sector they worked in. Because this was a CCI exercise, it's not surprising that most people work in NGOs, but we also had good representation from government, universities, international organisations like the EU and the UN, and fewer, but still some representation of the private sector. And I should say people could choose more than one of those organisations, which is why they add up to more than 100. We also asked people whether they mainly worked in research or practice. Most people worked mainly in practice, but we also had representation from research and quite a lot of people who said they worked in both. And I think we were pleased about this as well. We were really interested in how the pandemic is affecting conservation in the ground, but it's also important to understand impacts on research and education as well. So I think we were quite pleased that we've got good representation of the various different aspects of conservation in order to suggest that our results are representative. So this is the top 10 results, impacts as ranked by those 46 people. And I guess one thing that jumps out is of the top 10 impacts, 9 are negative, which suggests there are challenging times ahead for the conservation community. As I said, 40% I think of the total list were positive, but only one of the top 10, and it's number 10, has a positive impact. There were 2 impacts that were jointly ranked first in this exercise. The first one being environment being sidelined in economic recovery. And I think there's already evidence of this. So governments pushing economic recoveries are funding big infrastructure projects. They are putting money into fossil fuel and extractive industries and either sort of turning a blind eye or rolling back on the environmental restrictions related to those. The second, but equally top-ranked impact of increased habitat destruction, I think is again also been seen. And I think that's tied to an increase in the incentives for habitat destruction, so loss of maybe other livelihoods, and a decrease in disincentives, whether that be legal restrictions being lifted or at least not enforced, and maybe lower human presences in some of these habitats. Another big theme coming out of the top 10 is reductions in funding for conservation, whether that be from ecotourism, governments or philanthropy. And you can see, I think there's good evidence that all these things are going to be affected quite significantly, which is obviously going to be concerning and challenging for a lot of organisations. And that obviously links into number 8, about the fact that conservation organisations might actually struggle to survive if there really isn't enough income coming in, but they've still got outgoings ongoing. I guess another one that stands out as being a bit different is the increase in plastic and other pollution at number 3. So that's linked to increase in a lot of single-use plastics to avoid contamination, and also PPE, and maybe the rolling back on some of the restrictions on single-use plastics because of concerns about contamination and passing on the virus. And just to mention that positive effect at number 10, so obviously it seems like coronavirus came from a wild animal population, and there is evidence that restrictions on animal trades and sales and movements are being enforced, particularly in China and Vietnam. So hopefully there may be some positive effects on wild populations of those species. I'm not going to go into detail of the top 20, but I just wanted to put it up to show that there are more positive impacts between 11 and 20. I think there's 7, particularly related to the potential for a green recovery of the economy, and that there might be opportunities there, talking about investing in sort of renewable energy, nature-based solutions, that kind of thing, which might be a positive impact of the disruption that the pandemic has caused. And there's also the potential of increased international cooperation if countries can manage to work together over the pandemic. Maybe that will extend to other things like environmental legislation and conventions. And there's also a couple about switching to remote working and the benefits that might bring in terms of cost saving and inclusivity. The other thing I just thought I'd quickly mention is there was quite a lot in the news about positive impacts on wildlife, particularly early on in the lockdown, about city centres being deserted and wildlife reclaiming the streets. And those impacts were included in our list, and they were given high probability because they'd already been seen, and relatively high importance, but they were thought to be very short-lived, and I think that's probably right, so they didn't come out highly in the final ranking. As I mentioned, restrictions on wildlife trade was the highest positive impact. And one other thing that's been suggested and talked about quite a lot is the fact that habitat loss and fragmentation may have contributed to the movement of the disease between animals and humans, and that if we could protect habitat more effectively and reduce fragmentation, that would reduce the chances of future zoonoses. So that would be a positive change that could come out of this. But although people rank that high for magnitude and duration, they thought it was unlikely to happen. And just a few final points to say that, as I say, most of the high-ranking impacts were negative, so it seems like conservation is going to be facing increasing challenges over the coming years, and even more concerningly, having fewer resources to address them, with governments focusing on the economy at the expense of environmental legislation. So I guess the message is that we need to be adaptable, to be creative, and to look for alternative opportunities and solutions. I put up these couple of pictures, which are from one of the ELP projects in Romania. And during lockdown, they asked their rangers to instead start working on supplying elderly people in the community with food, and also working with an IT company to give secondhand laptops to kids so they could work from home. And that turned out to be a really positive thing for their relationship with the community and how the community views their organisation. They weren't doing it for that reason, they were doing it just to be helpful, but it's had positive impacts in terms of how they relate to the community, which hopefully will carry over to their conservation work. So I wanted to put that up as a sort of hopeful story that I have heard. But of course, there's still much uncertainty. I think if we did this exercise, even now, 2 months late or 3 months later than the original one, we would get different results. And I think it will be really interesting to revisit in a year or two's time and see what we were right about and what has changed. And just want to finish with this very important slide to acknowledge and show you the large number of people who were involved both in compiling the list of impacts and assessing them, and we couldn't have done it without them all. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Nancy. Very interesting indeed. I'm glad you ended up on a positive note after that rather depressing, but I'm sure correct analysis showing that there's, as well as some good news, there's an awful lot of bad news and worrying issues coming up. So if you could ask questions in just about Nancy's talk, so we'll have, as I said, a general discussion afterwards about so my screen's jumping back. We'll have a general discussion afterwards about what we could do about COVID. So if you've got any questions, anyone stick your hand up or ask in the chat if anyone has a question. Can I ask you, Nancy, so we had a global list of participants. Do you think there was much global variation in the issues that people submitted or how their voting worked?
That's a good question, and we didn't look at that explicitly. I mean, definitely when you read the list of project impacts, there are some are much more relevant to some countries than others. So, for example, the reduction in ecotourism money was definitely, a lot of the references were from South Africa and Kenya, and people not travelling to those countries. But when we talked to our projects in the Endangered Landscapes Programme, some of them said actually they're getting, like the Cairngorms, for example, are getting more tourists and visitors because it depends on where they're coming from. And if they're internal visitors, they may actually be visiting these sites more. But yeah, it will be interesting to look at. But I'm sure definitely when you could see as the list was circulated, that particularly the alumni definitely brought a different perspective into it.
Thank you. Georgina.
Oh, sorry, that's my camera. Thanks, Nancy. That was really interesting. I just wanted to pick up on a point towards the end of your presentation where you mentioned about, I guess, possibly the short-lived benefits of kind of a decrease in human disturbance. And I remember towards the beginning of lockdown seeing lots of articles about, wildlife come back and now humans aren't out there, sheep have come back to Welsh villages and that kind of thing. But I also wondered whether the respondents to your survey had talked about kind of, is this feeding into a worrying narrative, this kind of eco-fascism narrative that seems to be going around, you know, basically the idea that, you know, humans are a plague on the planet, and, you know, the most that we could ever hope for is just to basically leave nature alone. And, you know, it kind of, I worry that that narrative sometimes of, oh, you know, look what happens when we leave nature alone, it doesn't, to me, it doesn't help build an optimistic vision for humans living in harmony with nature. So actually, yeah, that narrative worries me a little bit, and I just wondered whether participants had kind of reflected on that at all. This kind of being seen as a completely positive thing, if that makes sense.
I guess this was quite a straightforward ranking exercise. So although people could leave comments, it was quite a quantitative exercise. And in the paragraphs, we were very limited by word limits, so they're quite to the point. There's definitely a lot more we could think about. I guess two things to say on that. One is that I think we can spin that positively, as in nature can recover really quickly, and it has powers of recovery, and we don't always have to do it for it. And I guess the other thing is saying that although, and I think people mainly took it as positive as, oh, there's wildflower in the Rhone, or oh, I can on my walk through town and now I can see ducks without being disturbed or whatever. And very much, I mean, I'm sure we're all aware of it, but the people observing nature in their gardens and in their localities, definitely, I think there was a lot of connection there. So I think the fact that nature came back and people just slowed down enough to see it probably had more positive than negative impacts. And I think, yeah, I mean, all those memes of monkeys going through the streets of Delhi and stuff, I think most people thought they were funny rather than saying we should really get rid of people. And yeah, that's a sort of sustainable way to conserve the world.
Yeah, sure. And it did only seem kind of a small proportion of people that were sort of saying that, but it's just a trend, I guess, in what people are saying that I noticed quite a bit towards the beginning of lockdown of, oh God, aren't we awful? And, you know, we shouldn't be here type thing. We're a plague on the planet. And I just wondered whether, you know, we as a conservation community had a responsibility to try and tackle that a little bit and find more examples of humans living in harmony with nature.
Okay, two questions and then we'll move on. Sue.
Thanks, Bill. That was a fantastic talk, Nancy. Very good timing too, because we're just doing, there's a special issue of Parks magazine just being compiled on protected areas. I expect you know about that. I'm involved with the MPA paper, and I was really intrigued that your habitat destruction had come out right at the top there. We have done an organised survey for the marine environment. We've been collating all these anecdotal reports, and there are, although in some places fishing has increased, so you could expect there might be some problems, there've also been a lot of positive feedback that, you know, the marine environment is actually doing well out of this. I don't know how that would play across the board, you know, if you were to do some more organised survey, but I just wondered if you got many people with a marine background in the survey. Did you do a breakdown on that? Because often there are differences, I think, possibly quite significant differences between sort of the bigger ecosystems that would be interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and we didn't break it down by habitat. We definitely had people submitting sort of marine themed impacts, so there were several about fisheries and whether illegal fishing was increasing or decreasing, or illegal fishing increasing but destructive fishing decreasing, and they didn't come out highly ranked. So maybe, I imagine most people, when they were thinking about the habitat destruction, were thinking of terrestrial habitat, and that might be a reflection of the participants. I think that's true. We definitely were trying to be inclusive, but there probably were some biases in there.
Sorry, I probably can't ask another one. I was intrigued to know what kind of habitat destruction was coming across as being.
So I should remind myself, but definitely things like logging. So I think probably it would be an emphasis on tropical systems where people are, where enforcement is low, there are less tourists, and there are rangers or whatever are in lockdown. So, yeah.
Thank you. Samuel. Go for it.
Yeah. Hi, Nancy. William. I am MPhil student, current MPhil student. Nancy, just two questions. One is you mentioned that there is an increase in illegal harvest of wildlife. So I mean, like in terms of hunting pressure. But you also mentioned that there was a reduction in trade. So my question is, like, I mean, it may be obvious, but like, is this a harvest for the subsistence, protein requirement to the local communities, or was there any trade in the maybe in the local or the regional level that was accounted for? So there's a first question. Second question is, you mentioned that that there's a reduction in nature-based ecotourism. That's obvious. It's not a question, but my thing is, like, I think we have been too much focusing on ecotourism, for the local communities. But I think as conservation, organizations or people working conservation, I think we need to look for more other livelihood, skills that we can impart, so that this kind of COVID pandemic will not have severe, maybe something other than ecotourism, something to do with their livelihood improvement, or some other yeah. So thank you.
So if I could, I'll answer your second point first, and I think that's exactly the kind of thing we want to talk about in the discussion later. Is what you're talking about is a response to the fact that ecotourism may be affected for quite a long time, and that it's not good to be dependent on that. So I absolutely think that is one of the responses that conservation organisations should be thinking about, not saying wildlife tourism is some kind of panacea that will provide sustainable livelihood out of biodiversity. So I think that's a really good point. In terms of the illegal harvest of wildlife, I'm pretty sure that was one that was written up as both a positive and a negative impact. So, as you say, the increase in pressure comes from maybe loss of other livelihoods and loss of enforcement, so you're getting more illegal trade. But I think there was the thought that so for local use, but the thought that the illegal harvest for trade was likely to become more difficult because of restrictions. Yeah.
Many thanks. That's great, Nancy. That's perfect. Now it's a great pleasure to introduce Mike Maunder. He's, as everybody knows, the new or newish CEO of CCI. I've seen him in the David Attenborough building, so he does actually exist in 3 dimensions, which I wasn't sure of for a long time. But great to see you, Mike. And he's going to talk now on the conservation impact of COVID-19, a personal perspective. Mike.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join you. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen?
You can, and your slide preparation.
Yeah, let me just
go on.
Yeah, let me just go to there we are. There, good. Right. Nancy's given you a really comprehensive analysis of the big picture impact of COVID. Mine is a bit more of a personal narrative. Many of you know I'm really a humble administrator and not a research scientist. So this is coming out of my background in managing biodiversity institutions and looking at how conservation is funded and how conservation messages are purveyed. The title is a quote, and this may be the first time that Phineas T. Barnum has ever been quoted within the Cambridge Conservation Initiative building. Notorious circus man, he said, every crowd had a silver lining. We're missing the crowds. Conservation is crowdless at the moment. And we're not getting the people in our protected areas. We're not getting the happy throng on the stairs here within the David Attenborough building. And we're not getting the crowds to the biodiversity institutions that we take for granted. And there's going to be some implications to that, and I'll explore that as we proceed. The picture is from the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and this is ICADA, the Arid Land Agricultural Research Institute that was moved from Syria as a result of the civil war and is now with the American University of Beirut in the Bekaa. And they kept a team going during most of lockdown, but all of their seed collecting trips throughout the Middle East went on hold, and a lot of the regeneration from their seed bank went on hold. So they lost, and many gene banks around the world lost their season, where they couldn't replenish their seed collections, couldn't regenerate their seed collections, and actually had difficulty distributing some of their seed collections. But they managed to fight their way through, and part of this is institutional response. So I'm wearing 3 hats for this presentation. A species conservationist, is someone who really is a bit of a species addict, an advocate for urban biodiversity, and as Bill said, the relatively recent and distinctly nervous new director of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. I joined as COVID hit. I came up to be interviewed in a busy, exciting building with conversations and hubbub in all directions. And today we had about 45 people in out of a capacity of 500, but there was at least 9 people in the coffee room at one point, which I thought was a good move. So it's worth reminding us what it means to the whole planet. There's personal tragedy, there's personal frustrations, but with the global impact, and this week's Economist really outlines this in great clarity. Biggest economic shock since World War II, so there will be inevitably implications to our daily work and our activities. 500 million full-time equivalent jobs disappeared within a week. Extraordinary impact, and the world economy shrank by 5%. Our 2009 recession has been our latest benchmark in financial troubles, shrank the world economy by 1.1%. And what I think is really troublesome for us is that 2 decades of work to alleviate global poverty have been frustrated, have been lost. And so rural poverty, poverty in the South, a lot of those gains will disappear or have disappeared with unemployment. And that, I think, has encouraged a lot of people to go back to the land to make a living. So I'm certainly aware from friends that charcoal cutting has increased dramatically in Eastern Africa, and informal wood harvesting to sell on streets. And one example that really surprised me is suddenly peat from the upland bogs of the Ruwenzori and those other Afro-Alpine areas are coming onto the markets of big towns as a way of making money and supplying cheap fuel. All sorts of ramifications we would never have guessed about. So in the broad sweep of history, it's just another pandemic caused by globalization. You could go back to smallpox. You could go back to rinderpest. You could go back to the loss of the Dutch elm trees across North America and the whole of Eurasia. And the ramifications for those still roll on. Smallpox and rinderpest are still there. Ramifications for conservation planning will be with us, have been with us for centuries and will be with us for a long time. But particularly, let's look at institutional viability and funding for conservation, urban biodiversity opportunities. I think we're actually on a really big opportunity here. And then a little bit about where we go next with CCI. So there was a benchmark in the 1980s in the UK and really also in the US and most other northern economies where the Blessed Margaret Thatcher instituted the Heritage Act that moved government funding of our great institutions, whether they be cultural or biodiversity, and started loosening the reins on government commitment for funding and encouraging those institutions to depend more heavily on philanthropy and the leisure market, the crowds that have a silver lining. So financial success for institutions like my own haunt, Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, was increasingly based around management of crowds and encouraging of spending. So Kew at the moment has an annual budget of about 93 million. 16% of that comes from trading, 15 million from cups of coffee, books, calendars, greeting cards, potpourri. and from philanthropy. And there's a direct relationship between visitation and philanthropy. And COVID, if it hasn't ruptured, has certainly bruised that relationship, where we have increasingly looked for private enterprise to support institutions that provide a national and global role. And you can see the same in discussions in Colombia about museums. You can see the same with the great biodiversity institutions in North America. And I think we've got to look at this very carefully as to whether COVID and the succession of whatever comes next means that we can't depend on crowds to the extent we have done under this happy interval of the last 40 years. And I think this is particularly the case for natural history museums, and here we are with a wonderful museum next door to us. UNESCO announced in June that 90% of the world's museums had closed at some time or another during the COVID crisis. So millions of people were excluded from inspiration and education and information through visiting all museums. UK museums estimate a 700 million gap in funding for UK museums, and that covers natural history, cultural heritage as a whole. And then one of our great natural history treasure houses, the National Museums Liverpool, lost 5.9 million income during this year, and 100 jobs have been lost. And we're seeing this particularly in North America and Europe, where museums are co-financed by private and state money. So in Germany, for instance, where they're state funded, there hasn't been the layoffs. Where in the UK and North America, where you're looking at that combination of an endowment fund, haven't done that well, city or state funding, and then earned income and philanthropy, you're seeing very heavy cuts to collection management. You're seeing encouragement of early retirement. And at that point, that whole intellectual loss can be quite significant. And often those people are specialists in one particular biological group. And project and capital funding halted, and a general undermining in staff confidence, and a focus on the board, from the boards of those institutions, on rebuilding the wealth of the institution and not necessarily on rebuilding the science. And we're beginning to hear stories of collections that have suffered because the curators, the collection managers couldn't get in. And it just takes one air conditioner to break down and one pipe to leak, and you've got irreparable damage. Bottom picture, just to remind you where we used to go and what we used to do. We would go to museums and we'd enjoy these crowded occasions. That might not be around, we might have to live without that for the next year or two. And I think we've also got a special case for endangered species management with ex situ display institutions. The World Zoo and Aquarium Association again estimated that 90% of the world's zoos and aquariums were closed at some point in this last COVID episode. World Aquarium and Zoo Association claim that zoos and aquariums collectively are the third largest funder for conservation globally. I think it's an interesting quote. I would question it, but the scale of magnitude is correct. Collectively, WASA members spent 230 million a year on conservation investments. The Disney Conservation Fund, which comes out of some sort of biodiversity display facility at Disney, has released 100 million since 1995. Those institutions are now up against the wall. Chester Zoo, a world-class conservation zoo, costs them 1.6 million a month in operating costs. They've raised 3 million from a public appeal, an extraordinary event which showed that they were loved as an institution, showed they really had established themselves as a community institution in the northeast of England. They're still likely to have a shortfall of 5 million at the end of their operating year. Disney's Wild Animal Kingdom, probably the most capital intensive animal exhibit anywhere, incurred losses of 5.8 million a month, and that's dollars. So we're seeing a risk for species, those particularly species that are extinct in the wild and depend on zoos like the Guam rail. Many wildlife conservation projects depend on a mixture of state funding, government funded, philanthropy money, and zoo money, particularly in North America. So for instance, that's the coal propagation facility at the Moat Aquarium. Most British zoos and most European zoos and all WASA members put money into conservation funds, and those vary from a couple of thousand a year to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, from the big zoos. And they permeate out to all sorts of conservation projects all over the world. And that's under risk. And we've got a real risk that we'll see some of the big zoos looking at their business plans, moving away from investments in low charisma, low display value species. And I think we're in the point where we've got to start saying, does the government need to step back in and play a role in the ex situ conservation of species? Can this be totally dependent on, or largely dependent on, discretionary spending from the public? I think we've done very well out of it for the last 40 years. We need to see whether we can work it in the future. Well, we're heading towards a position where 70% of the world's population will live in urban environments. That may take a bit of a wobble as more people, there's talk of people moving out of the centers of town, but I think that trajectory is secure. And those cities are becoming more politically autonomous and able to set more of their own agenda. There's Manchester this week. And it's interesting, you should have a look at Geoffrey Park's book, The Sovereign City, where he sees cities, mayors, playing a much more active and vital role in setting the future agenda. And I think the environment urban environment is a case in point. During the last lockdown, easy access to green space was the strongest predictor of satisfaction with neighborhoods during the lockdown. And so we've got groups like the Trust for Public Land now campaigning for every American to have a public park or green space within 10-minute walk of their home. We're seeing similar initiatives in Europe. And equitable and accessible green spaces are now regarded as a human right. Now, they can be sterile green spaces like the one at the bottom. That's just probably 3 species of perennial grass and 2 hardy species of ornamental tree and a huge diversity of bacteria that feed on dog turds. Brilliant. Or can you have a really living environment that pumps out biodiversity and celebrates city living? Wildflower Meadows in Cambridge last year have been a case in point. So I'm delighted to see that wild landscapes in cities are now on the rise and on the agenda of many cities. In the last 2 weeks, I've been in conversations with the city government in Seoul, worked workshops with Singapore and Hong Kong. And we're moving towards green, sterile, inoffensive open spaces in cities to wild and diverse landscapes that can actually provide ecosystem services and regenerate biodiversity. But we have to push for those because green spaces can be dead zones for biodiversity. Sterile green lawns pumped full of chemicals, mown regularly, glass as a threat for bird strikes, biocide and fertilizer pollution, excessive water use, and even light pollution. So we've got to make sure that this new generation of green spaces are welcoming, are accessible, and fundamentally wild. And there's great case studies for that. This is a project I know well in Seoul in South Korea, and that was a canalized subterranean river a decade ago. And the amount of wildlife that's coming back in dragonflies and butterflies and freshwater fish is fantastic. And at a recent workshop in Seoul, we discussed how many of these are needed to bring salmon back into South Korea and into Seoul. Some big ambitions. And so biodiversity is an asset, and it can be a fight, part of our ammunition against the next disease. And recent paper by Gary Nabhan, a really great natural history writer, identified the psychological benefits of urban nature, green prescriptions, and a phrase I rather like, which is reciprocal restoration. You restore the land, you restore the soul, you restore human health. And this is really built into the new urban agenda that the UN is proposing. And the Chinese have taken this on at scale with their Chinese Sponge City initiative, where urban parks are designed as soaking places to absorb water to reduce flooding risk to the cities, and spectacular urban wetlands are being created. These are new wetlands on previously agricultural land, and I think you've got to look at the balance sheet between the national loss of coastal wetlands and the new artificial wetlands in cities. They're not the same, but the new urban wetlands point the way to a wilder city life. But biodiversity, particularly now, post-COVID or during COVID, we're not through it yet, can be seen as a threat. And the case study I'm going to direct you to is fairly recently, Rio de Janeiro was very proud of its pockets of rainforest in the city area, very proud of the fact that marmosets were resident in there, including the golden line tamarin, a globally threatened species. There's been a lashback against this following yellow fever in Rio, and even cases of monkeys and marmosets being killed. So we have to look at that balance between what the urban population is comfortable with and what it may be threatened by. And I think with COVID, we've got to be careful in our terminology so that every bit of wild vegetation is not viewed as a frothing mass of new diseases that will leap out and infect people. We've actually got to get people to understand that restoration is part of the response and part of the buffering of the land against the next disease. So here we are in a building designed for crowds, for a happy mass of cross-disciplinary scientists, conservationists, activists, to converse, collaborate, and innovate. And COVID has temporarily halted that. And I think we've learned some lessons from it. And again, Nancy talked about that. Home working is now established. Communications have been loosened up. The need for travel has reduced, and I hope that's a long-term reduction. I have not missed travel. I've missed meeting friends and colleagues, and I've missed some wild landscapes I love around the world, but I don't want to get back into the hamster wheel of traveling every month. I'm looking forward to a slower, more responsible travel. And working practices have changed. I think everyone's recognized that working at home is now part of the future. And that means CCI, our occupancy levels will need to be revised, our rental agreements, all sorts of things are going to be discussed. However, we're confident that fairly soon we can get the building back. We're planning for a safe, phased reopening that will really reinvigorate the creative culture of CCI. And I know a lot of you miss it, and I can't wait to see the building back bubbling again and being productive. So watch this space, there'll be activities. We are going to be guided by the university, and we're watching what COVID does. It's not going to go away in a hurry. And we're just going to have to be responsive, as I think we're in a sort of spluttering phase of COVID where it's going to be rolling around the planet for the next few years in different levels of intensity, and we need to watch it and respond to it. But ultimately, we need to keep this building going, and we need to keep the culture of collaboration and innovation very much alive here at CCI. So thank you very much. Oops, there we are.
Many thanks, Mike. Excellent. Look forward to seeing you and bubbling with you and everybody else.
I'm looking forward to bubbling with everybody. It's an exclusive bubble.
So if there are questions or points, and particularly about things, we've got just a few minutes left, things we could do in the future. How could we solve these problems? What are the opportunities? How could we minimize the sorts of risks that Mike has been describing? Any thoughts or suggestions from anyone, either by chat or putting your hand up?
Yep.
As a participant. So you've talked about the financial hit that's being taken. Has anyone done an estimate of what that might be? We're buying out and subsidizing all sorts of other industries.
Yeah,
I wonder if anyone has thought as to what that will be.
it's, to me, and another one of the big changes is suddenly government is back in and funding stuff. And I think we're going to see globally more government control of more heavy-handed government control of legislation and practice on land use and on human health. I think this has forced the governments globally to step back in where they might have actually given more free rein to NGOs in the past. I don't know, it's just a suspicion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been. I've been looking at some of the proposals. So the government has a 5-point plan, and Friends of the Earth and lots of other people have sets of proposals. I wonder if we should be doing more as a sort of CCI community to make it clear what should be done and what the ways forward are. Any thoughts, both of you, either of you, anyone else?
Someone's
I
got their hand up.
can see someone's got their hand up, Bill. William?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, thank you.
That was kind of it was kind of a separate point. So before you asked that question, Bill, so if anyone had any points on your bit there, I'll wait my turn, certainly.
No, go for it, Will.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'm probably going to make a mess of this because it's a bit of a strange idea, but it seemed like an appropriate time. So forgive me if it becomes a bit rambling and nonsensical, but I'll have a go. It was the sort of urban stuff that kind of got me thinking about this. It's something I've thought about before, and it's kind of about thinking about like the relationship between people and the natural world and between people and wildlife. And I often think at the moment we often have a sort of almost like, maybe you'd call it quite two-dimensional or sort of like Disneyfied version of how our interaction with the natural world should be. You know, it should all be lovely and it should all be great all of the time. Whereas I imagine a much more kind of natural relationship or sort of functional relationship in a sense is that sometimes things are good and sometimes things annoy you and sometimes animals are nice and sometimes they're pests and sometimes you want them and sometimes you want to get rid of them and do things like that. And I just wonder, because we've got to the stage whereby we're so efficient at getting rid of stuff that we almost have to always kind of have this narrative that we want things around all of the time, in a sense. But if we're going to be having this much more kind of urban wildlife setting, how do you think we go about kind of developing that much more kind of natural and an understandable relationship with the natural world and with wildlife, that, you know, it's a kind of give and take between the two. You know, you're sort of competing essentially on a more level playing field when you're living in and amongst it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but hopefully.
Shall I respond, Bill?
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating question because we've got used to green spaces being nicely regulated and non-challenging. And you know, the worst can happen is a grey squirrel comes up and steals out of your lunch pack. I love the whole, I don't know, during the summer you saw that story of how the wild boar numbers have resurged in Berlin. And there was a wonderful video of a man chasing a wild boar that had stolen his laptop. He was just dressed in his underpants. And I just thought, yeah, that's the new ecology. You just don't know what's going to hit you at any point. So we do need to develop as a culture a tolerance of nature not being perfect and not being romantic, and getting people to enjoy the erratic nature of it, whether that's migration or seeing a sparrowhawk do a kill, or the fact that the wildflowers looked good last week and don't look quite so good this week. So getting that sense of a tempo, understanding a tempo of an ecosystem and the tempo of seasonal change. But yeah, we've got to do something about it because we need people to love those areas and support them politically and support them financially. And they'll do that if they love them and enjoy them and make them part of their life.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Thanks to everyone for comments and thoughts. Thanks particularly for Nancy and Mike for those excellent talks, and look forward to seeing everyone next week the same time. So thanks so much for everyone for coming. That's really interesting, and hope we can find some way forward. It is a serious set of problems, and I think, as Nancy said, dealing with the negatives is kind of pretty critical, but also looking for the positives. That's what we need to do. Thanks so much. See you next week.